we're going to have just our last half hour here. Jeanne Wright, who's going to be the regulatory project manager and lead at MISHAR, will be talking about regulatory and clinical trials for therapeutics, and hopefully, given some of the discussions we had in our conversations today about the need for regulatory approval, this will be hopefully very insightful for you. So, Jeanne, let's be sure she's got the presenter.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. So, yes, I work for the MISHAR IND-IDE Investigator Assistance Program, and thanks for having me be your speaker today. There we go. So today I'm going to talk a bit about the therapeutic drug development process, and I'm going to be focusing mostly on clinical trials and the FDA review process and the regulations that surround those two steps until you get final drug approval. The FDA is divided into three centers relevant to clinical research review. The Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, called CDER, is responsible for regulating drugs, chemical entities, and proteins. The Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research, or CBER, is responsible for regulating biologics and related products. So those are blood vaccines, tissues, and cellular and gene therapies. And then the Center for Device and Radiological Health, CDRH, is responsible for regulating medical devices and radiation-emitting products. So who gives the FDA authority to regulate? The legal framework the FDA operates under is the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, or FD&C, and the final regulations are published in the Federal Register, which is a daily published record of proposed rules, final rules, and meeting notices. And it's collected in the Code of Federal Regulations, which is abbreviated CFR. So when we talk about the FDA regulations, we say 21 CFR and then which regulation specifically that we are talking about. So that's where those abbreviations and those numbers come from. So when you're talking about an investigational research application, you're going to be talking about the regulations found in 21 CFR Part 312, which are the regulations surrounding investigational new drugs, and that's for both drugs and biologics. If you're talking about actually receiving approval to market your drug or your biologic, then the regulations are found in 21 CFR 601 for biologics, for a biologics license application or a BLA, and 21 CFR 312 for a new drug application or NDA. So when you're talking about conducting human research in drugs and devices, there's other applicable regulations under Title 21 of the Code of Federal Regulations that must be followed. And those include 21 CFR Part 11, which are the regulations surrounding electronic records and electronic signatures. 21 CFR Part 50 are the protection of human subjects. 21 CFR 54, the regulations surrounding financial disclosure. 21 CFR 56, the regulations surrounding institutional review boards, or IRBs, which you were just discussing a little bit about. 21 CFR 58, good laboratory practices. 21 CFR 211 and 810 talk about good manufacturing practices. And then 21 CFR 1271 is good tissue practices, which is for biologics. So once a drug is well characterized in the lab and with animals, drug development moves into human clinical trials. Human trials usually start with healthy subjects for first-in-human or phase 1 trials. An exception to this would be cancer and HIV drugs, because you would not want to give those to healthy subjects. Initial phase 1 trials are usually dose escalation trials, and they establish safety and further characterize the drug in humans, including the PK properties. The maximum tolerated dose, or MTD, is established in phase 1 trials. And because investigators are looking to discover the MTD, phase 1 trials involve carefully regulated safety labs and stopping rules, and that's what the FDA is going to be looking at in those trials. These trials typically enroll 10 to 50 subjects. Some later phase 1 trials would include things such as bioequivalence studies, food effect studies, and drug interaction studies. Phase 1 studies generally take from 6 months to a year to complete. In phase 2 studies, sometimes called pivotal trials, the drug is given to a larger group of subjects. Since this is testing for effectiveness as well as safety, it's often in patients with the disease or condition the drug will treat. For controlled trials, patients receiving the drug are usually compared with similar patients receiving a different treatment, or they can be placebo-controlled. Or the standard of care FDA-approved drug can be your placebo or your non-treatment arm. The objectives focus on dose response, type of patients, frequency of dosing, or numerous other characteristics for safety and efficacy. These phase 2 trials typically enroll 100 to 300 subjects. In phase 3 trials, the drug is given to a larger group of patients with the disease or condition to confirm effectiveness, further monitor side effects, and evaluate drug interactions. These trials generate data on both safety and efficacy in larger numbers of patients in both controlled and uncontrolled trials, and often provide much of the information needed for the package insert or the labeling of the drug. Phase 3 trials typically enroll over 1,000 subjects. Then once the drug is approved by the FDA, phase 4 of post-marketing studies are conducted to gather information on the drug's effect in various populations and any side effects associated with long-term use. Different formulations, dosages, durations of treatments, medicine interactions, and other comparisons will be evaluated. These will include new age groups, races, and other types of patients that can be studied. The detection and definition of previously unknown or inadequately quantified adverse reactions and risk factors that are important to many aspects of these phase 4 studies. They're often included in black box warnings or any other post-approval warnings and notices for drugs. So there are key decision points for the drug during clinical testing throughout the different phases of the testing. So for effectiveness, when you're talking about preclinical studies, you just want to see if the drug is working in your animal models. Once you move into phase 1 studies, you want to make sure that biomarkers are heading in the right direction. And for phase 2, is it working in the intended illness? And then for phase 3, it's continued confirmation of your effectiveness. Regarding safety, in preclinical studies, you're looking to see if the drug is safe in animals, and any safety studies that are in animals need to be under good laboratory practices or GLP studies in order for the FDA to accept the safety testing when you go to them to move into human clinical trials. Once you move into phase 1 trials for safety, you want to see if the drug is safe in healthy volunteers at your intended doses. When you move into phase 2 testing, is it safe in patients at the intended doses? And then for phase 3, you're looking to make sure that there's no previously unidentified safety issues. Regarding manufacturing, for your preclinical studies, can you make enough for your animal studies? That's your main concern. Once you move into phase 1 trials, can you make enough for the early clinical studies? And when you're in phase 2, you're going to start to scale up the API to make sure it's successful and you have an acceptable quality. By the time you hit phase 3 trials, you're going to need to make sure that you have commercial quantity of your drug and it's high grade under GMP or good manufacturing practice. Regarding PK/PD and ADME, absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion, in your preclinical studies, you just need to make sure it has favorable animal PK and ADME profile. When you're moving into your phase 1s, does it have a favorable healthy volunteer PK/ADME profile? Phase 2, is it still favorable when you move on into into patients with disease? And then in phase 3, you're just going to confirm that it still has a favorable profile. You'll still be drawing some of those labs. So what is required from the FDA from you as an investigator to proceed through this process? So you don't need to go to the FDA for your preclinical testing, and as long as you're not involving any human subjects, and that's the same with our IRB. If it's not involving humans, then you don't need to go to the institutional review board here, the IRB Med. But once you want to move into your human clinical trial, federal law requires that a drug be the subject of an approved marketing application, which means it must be approved by the FDA before it's transported or distributed across state lines. So in order to test a new drug's safety and effectiveness in a human clinical trial before it has FDA approval, it must cross state lines, and so you must obtain an exemption from those legal requirements. This exemption is requested by submitting an investigational new drug or an IND application to the FDA. And once you have your IND, then you can proceed with your human clinical trials. As you move through the different phases of testing, you will submit those new protocols under your own IND that you have open for the trial. And then once you're ready to market the submission, you go back to the FDA and obtain an NDA, a new drug application, or a BLA, a biologics license application, depending on the nature of your drug. So can you go to the FDA prior to submitting your IND? The question is yes, and you should. The FDA actually encourages investigators to come to them early. They will offer guidance in their opinions as you proceed through your drug development program. And the motto of the FDA these days is come early and come often. And we have found that they are particularly receptive to investigators from academics. So we encourage all of the investigators to go to the FDA as they move along the process. And this pre-IND consultation program that the FDA has set up, some of the things that it does for you, it's good for identifying studies that will support the initiation of clinical trials. They will help to ensure that necessary studies are designed to provide the FDA the useful information that they need. You can gain FDA support for a proposed regulatory strategy. They provide opportunity for creative exchange of ideas and obtaining regulatory insight. Minimizing costs, this is a big one, by avoiding unnecessary studies. So especially your animal studies, your GLP studies, your very expensive studies, if you haven't gone to the FDA prior to that, it is always our recommendation to go to the FDA before you embark on those very expensive studies, and we'll show them, we'll give them the study and get their input and make sure that this is a study that will enable an IND and enable you to move forward with your human clinical trials. They help you clearly define endpoints and goals of your development program. It allows early interaction and negotiations with the FDA, and it also allows you to discuss available methods to enhance the development. For example, perhaps you would qualify for an orphan drug designation or a fast track designation or accelerated approval. So other than allowing a new drug or biologic to legally cross state lines, what is the purpose of an IND? So the purpose of an IND is to ensure subjects will not face undue risk of harm in a clinical investigation that involves the use of the drug. It authorizes a drug study in humans, and the FDA requires sufficient information to assess the safety of the intended research study. All studies that use a drug not approved for marketing by the FDA will always require an IND. But a new drug is not always a new molecular entity or an unapproved pharmaceutical. Approved drugs used in an unapproved or off-label indication, such as in a new formulation, in a new dosage, in a new patient population, that could put potential subjects at increased risk, also require an IND in order to proceed into human clinical trials. So there are IND exemptions. It's usually off-label use that would meet the exemption requirements to not require an IND from the FDA. And in order to meet that exemption, the drug has to be legally marketed or approved by the FDA, and it has to meet the following. There has to be no intent to support a new use or a labeling change, no intent to support change in advertising, no factors such as route of administration, dosage, or study population that it significantly increases the risk, and you would have to check with the approved drug label to make that determination. You have to agree to comply with informed consent and IRB review requirements, and you have to have no promotion or representation that your product is safe or effective for the treatment or the condition under study. Many U of M investigators, when they first want to look to study a drug in humans off-label, they are able to meet these exemption requirements, and these are defined in 21 CFR 312.2. So this is an IND decision tree to kind of help you decide whether or not, if you're using a drug off-label or just if you're using a drug in general, whether or not you think it would need an IND from the FDA. So you have your proposed study drug. And if it is an unapproved drug to the left, then it's always going to require an IND, and that's a simple one. But if it's an approved drug, then you're going to see if it's being used for an approved indication or it's being used off-label. If it's an approved indication, then you most likely do not require an IND. If you're using it off-label, then you're going to have to consult with the IRB or the FDA, and you can also consult with MyApp, and my contact information will be at the end, to decide if you think that there's an increased risk for the off-label use. And if it meets exemption requirements and there's no increased risk, then you don't require an IND. But if it does not meet the exemption requirements, then you will require an IND from the FDA in order to proceed with your human clinical trials. So who submits an IND application? So under an IND, the sponsor is not referencing the funding agency like we usually talk about when we talk about studies and who's sponsoring the study, but under the IND regulations, the sponsor is the person who initiates the clinical trial and takes responsibility for the conduct of the study. So sponsors can be pharmaceutical companies, and that's generally who the sponsor of the trial is, but it could also be an individual or an organization or a governmental agency. So an example is the NIH will often submit an IND for a multi-site clinical trial. So who's an investigator defined by the FDA? The investigator is an individual who actually conducts the clinical investigation, under whose immediate direction the drug is administered or dispensed to a subject. So a sponsor investigator is an individual investigator who initiates and conducts a clinical study, as well as being directly accountable for the administration or dispensing of the investigational drug. So here in academics, lots of times we submit INDs on behalf of sponsor investigators. So they would be both those roles. They would be the IND sponsor and they would be the investigator. What's required of an IND application? These requirements are found in 21 CFR 312.23, and it requires a cover sheet, FDA Forms 1571 and 1572, and 1571 is the Statement of Investigator, and that's completed by the sponsor. 1572 is completed by all of the investigators in the investigational sites that will be participating in the trial. A table of contents, an introductory statement, and a general investigational plan. An investigator brochure, or an IB. If it's a sponsor investigator trial and it's in very early development, a full IB may not be necessary, but once you move into multi-site clinical trials, you're going to have an investigator brochure that can be distributed to all of the sites so that they can learn about the drug. You're going to need a study protocol and an informed consent. Chemistry, manufacture, and control information, and that's the bulk of the information. That will include all of your farm tox data and all of your preclinical testing up to that point. Any previous human experience, if this is a first-in-human study, there might not be any yet, but if there have been previous trials, that would be included. And then just any additional information the FDA could want. We usually encourage you to submit draft case report forms, protocol reference articles, or any reference articles about the drug safety you can submit to the FDA for your IND as well. So once you've submitted your IND, what happens? So FDA will assign a unique IND number, and the application will be forwarded to the appropriate reviewing division. Once the IND is submitted, the sponsor has to wait 30 calendar days before you can initiate any clinical trials. During this time, the FDA has an opportunity to review the IND for safety to assure that research subjects will not be subject to unreasonable risk. After the 30 days, the IND can be considered safe to proceed unless the FDA has notified you otherwise. The FDA may request further clarification or information during this 30-day review period, or they could just place the study on clinical hold, meaning they have additional information that you can't provide to them that quickly. Maybe they have some other studies, preclinical studies, that they would require that you haven't proven the safety to move into human clinical trials. Alternatively, the FDA may require changes to the study protocol or the consent document, and after you've made those changes according to the FDA's requirements, you may be considered safe to proceed. So once you also have IRB approval and then you have your IND in place, you can proceed with the clinical trial. So once you have an IND, are you done reporting to the FDA? The answer is absolutely not. You have IND maintenance activities that are required of an open IND. You have to submit IND amendments, and there's 4 major types. There's protocol amendments, and informational amendments. And protocol amendments can be a change in a protocol, or if you're deciding to start a new protocol. Information amendments, that's just any information you've changed some manufacturing about your drug, anything that you need to tell the FDA. IND safety reports, which are adverse event reports. Those are very important. And then every year you have to submit an annual report to the FDA about the IND. These are just some timelines about the submissions and when they have to be reported to the FDA. I won't go through all of these right now, but it's a nice reference to have, and it's just kind of to show you how quickly some of these reports have to be, as short as 5 working days or 7 calendar days for some of these submissions to the FDA. So regarding marketing, once you've completed all of your clinical trials, if you are going to proceed to market your drug, you will submit a new drug application, an NDA, or a biologics license application, a BLA. And with those, the FDA has to determine whether the drug is safe and effective in its proposed use and whether the benefits of the drug outweigh the risk. So, of course, if the population that's going to be taking this drug is suffering from a pretty serious disease or illness, then the benefits are going to be higher, so that the FDA is going to tolerate more risk. If your population if it's a pretty low, you're just treating a skin rash, you can't have a lot of risk there because the risk is going to outweigh the benefit. Whether the drug's proposed labeling or the package insert is appropriate and what it should contain. So you have to have already written your package insert at that time, and you submit that as part of the marketing approval application. Whether the methods used in manufacturing the drug and the controls used to maintain the drug's quality are adequate to preserve the drug's identity, strength, quality, and purity. So you have to have all of your good manufacturing practices in place at that time, and you have to submit all of those to the FDA. These applications are very large documents. Now that you can submit them electronically, but years ago you couldn't, and sometimes it would be a whole truck full of documents that like Pfizer would send to the FDA for some of these drugs. It includes results from all preclinical and clinical testing, as well as comprehensive description of the drug's composition, manufacturing process, packaging, and a proposed draft label. These applications aren't mandated by law and how quickly they have to be reviewed like the IND, but it's generally the FDA strives for a 10-month review time for these applications. So, just to give you some overview about MyApp services, all of those things that I just talked to you about, we actually can assist you to do. It can be pretty overwhelming to have to try to interact with the FDA if you've never done so before, submit an IND application all on your own, and even set up some of those pre-IND meetings that we talked about. And so those are some services that we actually provide for U of M sponsor investigators. So we will help you with agent device development and help you to develop your regulatory strategy. We will provide consultation and help you decide if you need an IND in order to conduct a human clinical trial. We will help you set up any pre-IND FDA meeting requests and support. We offer protocol and informed consent review from a regulatory perspective. We will help you submit an IND application to the FDA. If you have a clinical hold or a conditional approval of that application, we will help you with that response and help you make any necessary changes. We'll help you with our communications with the FDA and the IRB and other regulatory bodies. And then all of that IND maintenance that I talked about, we would help with that all the way up until the point that you're ready to withdraw your IND from the FDA. And this is just the MyApp team with some of my coworkers and all of our contact information. And I'm there on the upper right there, Jeannie, and so feel free to contact me if you have any questions that you think of later, or if you decide that you want to meet with us and talk about some of the services that we provide. So does anybody have any questions right now regarding the presentation that I could answer?
Hi, Jeanne. I did have one question here. I was back a few slides ago, but in the IND proposal, you mentioned you're submitting data in the CMC section in the previous human experience. Is that only GLP studies that you're submitting there, or you're just, or I guess that's the question.
So the FDA will accept non-GLP studies, especially if it's not safety toxicology data. But what the FDA will ask is they will ask you, when you submit any studies, they will ask you if they were performed under GLP. And if they were not performed under GLP, they will ask you how they deviated from GLP. They may ask you to repeat some of their pivotal studies, and like I said, especially if they're safety studies, but we have submitted non-GLP studies before and had the FDA accept them.
Okay.
That's a great question.